Thank you so much for joining us today for this event celebrating the publication of Siv B's Django Generations, hearing Ethnorace, Citizenship, and Jazz Manouche in France, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in the Chicago Studies and Ethnomusicology series. My name is Molly McPhee, and I had the pleasure of working with Siv on the book. We would like to extend our thanks to the Seminary Co-op Bookstore for co-hosting the event. You can purchase Siv's book from the Sem Co-op at a link that I will post in the chat shortly. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the author and our two discussants, Ingrid Monson and Carol Silverman. First, the author, Siv B. Lee, is Assistant Professor of Music at the University of Maryland. Her research in ethnomusicology and linguistic anthropology explores relationships between cultural production, race, and politics. She has published in Ethnomusicology, the Journal of the American Musicological Society, Popular Music and Society, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Jazz and Culture, and French Cultural Studies. She is co-founder and principal coordinator of the Initiative for Romani Music at New York University and a curator of the music section at Rome Archive. She is also a violinist, violist, and vocalist. Our first discussant, Ingrid Monson, is Quincy Jones Professor of African American Music at Harvard University and currently chairs the music department. She is the author of Freedom Sounds, Civil Rights Call Out to Jazz in Africa, Saying Something, Jazz Improvisation Interaction, and an edited volume entitled The African Diaspora, A Musical Perspective. Her essays have appeared in Critical Inquiry, Journal of the American Musicological Society, Daedalus, Black Music Research Journal, and many edited volumes. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and currently writing on Malian balafonist Neba Solo. Our second discussant, Carol Silverman, has been involved with Balkan music and culture for more than 40 years as a researcher, teacher, performer, and activist. An award-winning professor emerita of cultural anthropology and folklore at the University of Oregon, she focuses on Balkan music, festivals, cultural policy, and human rights issues among Roma people. Based on fieldwork in Bulgaria, Macedonia, New York, and Western Europe, her research analyzes the relationship among music, politics, ritual, and gender. Her 2012 book, Romani Roots, Cultural Politics in Balkan Music and Diaspora, won the book prize from the Society for Ethnomusicology, and her 2021 book, Balkanology, traces politics and artistry of Bulgarian wedding music. Her numerous articles analyze the globalization of Gypsy music, specifically its performance, consumption, and production in relation to issues of representation and appropriation. She works with the US NGO Voice of Roma, is curator for Balkan music for International Digital Rome Archive, and is a professional vocalist and teacher of Balkan music. So now Siv will give us a presentation on the book, which will be followed by remarks and questions from Professors Monson and Silverman. We hope to leave some time for questions at the end of the presentation. So if you do have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I can direct them to Siv once the formal remarks have concluded. So Siv, I pass it off to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Molly. I'm just going to go through a few thank yous as well, because this is I think the right forum to do it. So I want to say, first of all, thank you to the entire team at Chicago who have made this book possible. This includes my wonderful acquisitions editor, Elizabeth Branch Dyson, series editors, Philip Bowman and Timothy Rahman, promotion managers, Carrie Olivia Adams, Ryan Lucier, Eleanor Ford, production editor, Tamara Gattas, copy editor, Marian Tatum, and of course, my editorial associate, Molly McPhee, who has just been my lifeline throughout this whole process and has been amazing to work with. So thank you for emceeing today. I also want to deeply thank Carol and Ingrid for joining me today. Both of you have been such amazing inspirations and really mentors to me throughout my scholarly career. So it feels kind of surreal, I have to say, to be doing this right now. And I also just, I have a million other people to thank, but I don't want to exhaust my time right now. So you all know who you are and you can find yourselves in the acknowledgements. So thank you for being here today. I'm gonna just do like a quick little slide presentation here. It'll be fairly brief. And just give a kind of an overview of the book itself and what I'm kind of trying to do with this book. So this hopefully won't take too long. And I know some of you here have read the book, some of you have not, but might be familiar with it. So I just want to make sure we're all on the same page about it. So this book is about the entanglement of racial ideologies and citizenship with musical communication in France. And I focus on a genre called Jazz Manouche, which is also known in English as Gypsy Jazz. And this genre is based primarily on the recorded work of the famed guitarist Django Reinhardt, who also happened to belong to the Romani group of Manouche people for whom the genre is named. And I think of this book as being nominally about Jazz Manouche, but really it's mostly about racial ideologies in France. And as you can see on this slide, I've got the basics of the book here, but I also have put on here the web address for the companion website, which you can go to. It has material for right now for chapters 1 through 4 and chapter 5, and the conclusion are in the process of being uploaded. But I strongly recommend you check that out, especially if you haven't read the book. It might be a good way to entice you into it. And so since this is a book about music, I figured it might be nice to get some of the music actually in your ears right from the get-go. So I'm going to play a couple of examples. One is going to be some source material from Django Reinhardt himself, and that will be followed by an example of contemporary Jazz Manouche performance. So this first example, it's a tune called Hungaria, which was composed by Django Reinhardt, and he recorded this, I guess, exactly 80 years ago. So the opening, you will hear Django Reinhardt soloing. I'll just pause it there. That was Andre Ekian taking the solo from Django Reinhardt, and Ekian solos pretty much throughout the rest of this tune. So that's the original, one of the original source materials that Jazz Manouche is based on. So to bring us more towards the present day, I'll play you a clip of a video that I shot myself at the Festival Jazz Manouche de Zillesheim in June 2014. So the ensemble performing here is really a family affair. So the guitarist on the left, his name is Janito Felix, and he is the son of the guitarist who's second from the right, whose name is Yori Felix, who is the brother of the guitarist on the right, Sebastian Felix, who is the father of the bassist Esteban Felix. So this video kind of encapsulates one thing that I talk about in the book, which is how Jazz Manouche is both a very much a community practice that's passed down from generation to generation, but it's also a kind of family business as well, as these musicians demonstrate. So they're playing the exact same tune, based very much on Django Reinhardt's 1941 performance of it. I'll just pause it right there, but I'm happy to play more of this later if anybody wants. So as you can tell, this genre is very string centric and especially guitar centric, especially given Django's the music's roots in Django's music and how he really pioneered the use of the guitar as a solo instrument in jazz. This genre also involves a rhythm guitar technique known as the pomp, which you heard very clearly in this last clip. And that's a really kind of driving, regular, almost percussive right hand technique that Janito and Yori over here are both performing. And this instrumentation that you see here explains in part my own beginnings with the genre because myself, I've played violin and viola ever since I was a kid. And although I was classically trained as a teenager, I started wanting to learn jazz. And as many of you might know, if you're a violinist and you've tried to make the transition from classical music to jazz, one of the first people that you hear about is Stefan Grappelli, who was Django's most well-known collaborator as a violinist. And so I got into Jazz Manouche as a performer, but as I started learning more about the cultural context in which this music was made, I also got very interested in larger political questions about Romani identity more broadly. And that experience, along with the fact that I had a very supportive and research-oriented undergraduate foundation in anthropology, really led me to go to grad school for ethnomusicology so I could study how this genre was being used in Romani political contexts. So this kind of helps get me to more about like how I came to this topic for my book. And so getting more into the subject matter of the book, as many of you I'm sure are aware, Romanis who are otherwise known oftentimes pejoratively as gypsies have long been the subjects of persecution in Europe and well beyond Europe. And as many scholars have pointed out, they are also celebrated for their music as well as other art forms. And Jazz Manouche is no exception to this process. So it was pioneered largely, though not exclusively, by Manouche musicians. And it's probably the most widely and positively recognized Manouche cultural practice that there is. At the same time, Jazz Manouche is considered to be a musical emblem of French national identity. And this is despite the fact that Manouche face quite a bit of discrimination in France and are not considered to be part of its national cultural fabric. So this situation is exacerbated by the fact that France really likes to see itself as a colorblind nation. So in the eyes of the law, ethno-racial and religious differences aren't really supposed to be recognized. And what this means is that candid talk about race is often censured, whereas at the same time, racially minoritized groups have to live the effects of racialization all the time. So one of the arguments that I put forth in the book is that music and talk about music provide avenues for people to deal with racialization when some of the more obvious avenues they might use otherwise might not be available to them. And so I also look at how in some cases and with varying degrees of success, people try to transform their positions as racialized subjects through these different semiotic means. And as I argue in the book, music can be an important but also an insufficient tool in struggles for racial and economic justice. And Jazz Manouche provides a very potent opportunity for understanding how these struggles actually play out. And I'll just say maybe one last thing that kind of gets to how I've thought about the guiding concepts in this book. So a lot of the arguments that I'm making in this book hinge on one particular concept, which I call ambivalent essentialism. And by ambivalent essentialism, I mean the process in which a minoritized person will self-essentialize to some end, be it social, political, and or economic. And that comes along with a lot of uncertainty and cognitive dissonance. So for Manouche musicians, this means playing up the so-called Manouche aspects of their identity when they're marketing themselves, but then also having to grapple with the discomfort that doing so can arouse. And then in some cases, that discomfort leads people to end up refusing to self-essentialize, or to, in this case, refuse the label of Jazz Manouche in order to prove themselves as just regular, unmarked artists and citizens. So with this concept of ambivalent essentialism, I'm really trying to show how people deal with the unresolvable tensions of being minoritized and of navigating racialization for themselves. And so I'm hoping that this exploration can speak to other situations well beyond Romanese in France or Romanese more generally, but to other kinds of situations involving music and minoritized groups. So I'm just going to stop talking there and see what Carol and Ingrid have to ask.
Carol, we'd love to have you jumpstart the remarks and questions.
Okay, great. Well, hi, everybody. It's really an honor to be here. I really love this book, and I'm so happy to have seen it through different stages, having served on Siv's dissertation committee. It is really a different thing now, much more elegant, so beautifully written, extremely engaging. This book actually has something for not only ethnomusicology, but certainly for Romani studies, for French studies, for jazz studies. And so I think it should have wide readership. I really hope it does. I also am very impressed with the historical research that is included in the book. And for me, this was really eye-opening because I do follow French politics, but certainly I don't know about the different Romani organizations and what activist roles they played, their successes and their failures, and how musicians articulated with them, sometimes not in leadership positions, but sometimes forming projects together. This was really, really eye-opening to me. I also think one amazing strength of the book is the combination of micro and macro analysis. So to me, looking at the actual individual musicians, and Professor Lee really got close to quite a number of people and their families and captured their view from the inside of terminology, of interpreting performance context, and so on. But then she pulls back and also looks at the level of the community, although that's something I do want to ask her about, because we don't really hear about a unified community, and that's probably because there isn't. So I do want to know about that level, but pulling back to the state level and taking us through history as well. And of course, comparing to other sites of Romani music. It's very elegantly written, and there's actually a lot of theory placed in it in ways that make it digestible and actually non-jargonistic. So every concept, theoretical concept that she introduces is explained really well and made relevant by the specific examples that Professor Lee uses. So I think this is really a good model of writing. The last thing I wanted to point out about the book itself is the website, okay? And this is really an added attraction, not only clips, but also many historical documents and textual additions as well. So don't forget to look at it. It is really good. It's in progress, and I'm looking forward to the end chapters as well. So for me, I think I'd like to focus on this question I posed to Siv earlier about ethnorace and why she feels it's a useful concept and how it came about. Now, I'm very interested in the racialization of Roma, especially how it manifests in different historical periods and for different purposes. Because again, this is in relation to how we might, let's say, citizenship can be excluding, culture may be including or excluding, racialization may be good marketing and branding, but it may be bad for everything else in terms of rights. So I'm very interested in this nexus between race, ethnicity, and citizenship. And I think from the point of view of the Romani musicians, there's many examples in this book of people who in a sense, disavow politics. They don't even want to be associated with the term manouche in their music. And that may be because they've realized it's a stigma, obviously, or they're trying to recruit the level of citizenship as being just French. And so Professor Lee explores this, but I'd like to ask her to go in a little bit more into why ethno-race may be useful for this case, but also might be expanded for other cases of Roma music and actually Roma in general. And I see that also ethno-race is different in different decades of France. So we really do have to get into the specifics of the use of it. So I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol, for all of those really kind and helpful comments. And such a great question too. That's something I'm very eager to talk more about. So just to give some background on the term ethno-race, this is a term that I borrow from a writer named David Theo Goldberg, who's written extensively on race in Europe. And I use this term to draw attention to the kind of slipperiness between what people generally call race and ethnicity. And I started using this term because I found that both in my own conversations with people in my ethnographic work, but also in my archival work, I found that people were using both race and ethnicity to describe Manouche people in French, sometimes interchangeably, depending on the context, but sometimes it would be clear that there was a particular time period in which one term would be used more than another. And it just so happens that in the older stuff I look at, race is used more often. More recently, people speak of ethnicity, but again, they use both terms. And so I started feeling like, at first, I felt like I needed to make a choice of which one to use myself. But I also felt like that would be leaving something out of the story. And so I thought ethno-race not only eliminates the need to make that choice, but it also really captures the kind of work that both race and ethnicity are doing in each of these contexts. And a lot of the times people's use of either term depends really on what they want to say about a group of people at the time. So there's been work by, I draw a lot on the work of sociologist Roger Sprubaker, also linguistic anthropologist Bonnie Urtioli, who talks about race as being a kind of shifter, something, race and ethnicity being terms that you can use kind of differently depending on what you're trying to say and depending on the context. So for example, race is often used to talk about a group, perhaps in not just in a biological sense, but in sometimes in a kind of negative sense, or a sense of drawing attention to characteristics that might not be so appealing, whereas ethnicity is used in a more celebratory kind of sense a lot of the time. Of course, this depends on national, regional context and what have you, but there does tend to be a kind of trend, especially in France, where ethnicity sometimes serves as a euphemism for race. And this, of course, is because race is often considered to be a sort of taboo word in France, especially nowadays. France is undergoing its own kind of, we're having this moment of critical race theory kind of hysteria in the US, and there's its own version is happening in France. So race is a really, really charged word. So when people say ethnicity there, sometimes that could mean race or it could mean something else. So basically, I just wanted to use ethno-race both as an analytic to capture all of these different uses and kind of and not have to decide, but also to really capture how people are using these terms in real life, and how the kind of slipperiness between them can also tell us a lot about how people think of cultural practices as kind of nurtured, as thoroughly cultural, or certain kinds of behaviors and traits as being natural, as being inherited. And so again, the use of that terminology really kind of gets at that. So anyway, to get to your question also about how this could be more broadly applicable, I have found in my research in Romani studies that ethnicity tends to be the dominant word when talking about Romani people as a group. They are often characterized as an ethnic group, whereas in many situations, it's very clear that they are being racialized. And so I'm hoping that this word might take up a little bit more traction in Romani studies to kind of get at these tensions of how Romani people are being portrayed, but also even beyond Romani studies to other fields of study as well that deal with race and or ethnicity in some way. Yeah, my hope is that this can be a more commonly used approach.
Thank you so much, Siv. And Ingrid, we'd love to hear your thoughts and questions for Siv as well.
Okay. Well, see, first of all, congratulations on your book coming out. It's I just love getting the hard copy after seeing it in earlier stages. And as you know, I am also a major fan of this book. I think, first of all, you deal with the music incredibly well. You deal with the relationship of the music and the politics of Romani cultural identity and the politicization of that. And you talk about the relationship of the musicians to the politics of that moment. But I was blown away when I got to the point where you started talking about ambivalent essentialism. I just think that's an incredibly productive way of putting it. And I also really like your definition of it. So you describe here ambivalence here is the space between embracing a thoroughly distilled identity and the feeling that there might be a better alternative. And then you also describe it as the push and pull at the heart of much social difference making, a process dependent in this context on modern political economic regularities. And I think when you do this, it's very clear that the idea, it works in the Romani context, but it also had me as an African American is thinking about how it operates here in the United States and the parallels between African American experience and Romani experience, which I first became aware of through Petra Gelbert, who is here today also. And I also really, really like the way you develop the idea, and that's through, I mean, at some point you call it a ratio-semiotic approach. You talk about ratio linguistics, but what it, you talk about racialization as a kind of semiotic process, and then you make really a really lucid explanation of that semiotics that's based on Charles Peirce and some of the latest thinking about qualia and how embodiment and things beyond language are involved in semiotic processes. So I'd love to hear more about how you got to that, conceptualization that then becomes a really productive way in which you link the micro and the macro. So that's one question. I have some nerdy questions about that, but I would also like to hear more about how the Manouche think about their relationship, their parallels or their differences from the situation of racialization with African Americans. So I think that's enough to deal with in a first set of questions, right?
That's a great first set of questions. Thank you so much for for really picking up on these, and I'm really glad that these ideas resonate with you. And I really deeply appreciate that. And so just to get to the first question about how I kind of came up with these frameworks, these kind of intersecting frameworks, a lot of it has to do with people I was reading and studying with throughout graduate school, and of course reading your work and saying something, and that kind of instilled curiosity for linguistic anthropology. And some of the people that I work with, notably my advisor David Samuels, who's a linguistic anthropologist, he really kind of pushed me down that road, and Bambi Shufflin, who's here right now, also really mentored me through so much of that as well.
Who taught me that? Yeah,
there you go. See, her influence just keeps going. So I just I really went down the linguistic anthropology rabbit hole as best I could, and found that the tools that that linguistic anthropology had to offer were just so revelatory and applicable to the situations that I was looking at. So I was really glad to have that kind of foundation before I went into the field. And then when I, went and did my field work, I just kind of started noticing a lot of things happening. But it wasn't until after I came back from field work and really started processing things that, it took years to kind of put all of these pieces together and really go through a lot of what people had told me and try to kind of piece it together into some kind of framework. So that's, the ambivalent essentialism part kind of grew out of how, you know, I had gone into this project with, you know, not a whole lot of experience, you know, with Manouche culture. I mean, I knew enough from what I had, you know, read and experienced very in a limited way at festivals and from talking to people, but really spending a lot of time with the people I talk about, getting to know them, developing trust and all of that, got me to kind of shake off some of the assumptions I had that might have been a little kind of one-sided, in that, you know, I was just noticing how so many of these musicians would kind of say one thing in one context, but then say something completely different in another context. And it wasn't that they were being insincere in any of these different contexts, but they just had different priorities to balance. And at first, I thought this was an interesting conundrum, but then I started really kind of thinking a lot more about how this is just, you know, how they are operating when they are oftentimes between a rock and a hard place of being asked to perform their Manouche-ness, and then also having these aspirations to be considered truly French, and then a whole bunch of other kinds of positions in between and beyond that. So that's kind of how I came to the ambivalent essentialism part. With the semiotic work, so that, as I said, grew from my interest in linguistic anthropology. The qualia part came from, I was introduced to that by the work of Nicholas Harkness, and then some other people who he had been working with kind of under the tutelage of Michael Silverstein. And it really struck me how the concept of qualia could really get at how sensuous experience is processed on an individual level, but then also comes to make up a whole kind of social framework for understanding the sensory world. And this was especially relevant because one of the things, as of course you know from chapter 4 of the book, is that many musicians claim to be able to hear a certain Manouche sound that they can feel, that is palpable to them, that they can't necessarily put in words, but they know there is just this something that is composed of different kinds of sensory descriptors for them, but can't boil down to any one of them or even those in combination. There really is this kind of this feeling. And so I found the language of qualia to be really helpful for sussing out exactly how they were coming to this kind of agreement about what sounds Manouche. So this is also somewhat related to your second question about the kinds of parallels that are drawn between Manouche music and Manouche experience and the African-American experience. And I found that with some regularity, Manouche musicians would draw explicit analogies between what they were doing and what they perceived African-Americans to have lived through, especially in the 20th century, and with their experience basically producing jazz. So I think for some of the musicians I worked with, the African-American experience gave them a kind of a model and a sort of language to talk about what they felt that they were undergoing in terms of their racialization, in terms of their own oppression. Obviously, they all recognize they're very different cases and very different contexts of racialization, but they saw this kind of common link through jazz, and jazz being this kind of, you know, some characterize it as a sort of language of oppression, which, you know, is arguable, but they really felt a sort of affinity with jazz aesthetics and the African-American experience that went through that. So yeah, basically, I think it was a useful way for them to express how they feel as racialized subjects when, especially in France, as I've gone on at length about the means for expressing that are sometimes somewhat limited.
Great, thank you so much. Carol, Ingrid, if you have any follow-up questions, it would be wonderful to hear them. Otherwise, we'd be very pleased to hear questions from the rest of from the audience.
I'd like to ask.
Oh, go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, I'd like to just ask something about, again, from the level of individuals, both performers and listeners, to taking it to the level of festivals and institutions, okay? Because to me, this whole working myself for a nonprofit that puts on festivals and studying festivals, to me, this is a really important intervention that you are doing here. Your whole next to conclusion chapter is about analyzing festivals. So you talk about, on the level of individuals, the kinds of decisions that musicians have to make, the struggles they have when they don't, perhaps one scenario is they don't want to be Manouche in the Manouche formula, but they have to because that's the branding, that's the marketing or something. But then there's other scenarios as well. But then there's these festivals and organizations that very often are run by Gage, non-Manouche, and have a particular scenario of how they're going to present things. And I thought that was really, really instructive for those of us that actually do engage in not only documentation, but advocacy. So these dilemmas, some of them don't come off very well in your description. Some of them have kind of erased Manouche in the 5th iteration of a festival or a commemorative person that actually was the reason for the festival. Some of them are supposedly promoting Manouche advocacy that is actually socioeconomic change, but recruiting music in a very superficial way, or the musicians aren't even involved in the decisions. So can you talk about that interface between advocacy and the legacy of these festivals? You talk about a number of them, including the failed ones, or the Apona institution that existed for 20 years, but doesn't exist anymore. And you revived it, or it exists through people, but you looked at it through archival sources and through people. So can you talk about that interface a little bit?
Great, thank you. That's a fantastic question, Carol. It's really something that's a little bit hard to sum up in just a simple answer. But my purpose in looking at these different institutions, and especially through festivals, which I found to be like a really great kind of lens through which to understand what these institutions stood for and what they actually believe their engagement with Romani people to be, and how Romani people in turn kind of engaged with them. My main goal was really to do exactly kind of what you're saying is, and show how individuals interface with them with differing ideas of what constitutes a community or a group, and like differing ideas about what the actual needs of any kind of constituency are. And so those became very apparent through the festival context. So I do look at, I focus on 3 separate festivals, each of which kind of take a different approach to engaging its Manouche constituencies. The Apona Festival, which went on for a very long time and was by all accounts very successful, and it only had to end because the organization itself was also starting to decline, due mainly to financial reasons, which of course is within a broader, political economic context in the region of Alsace where they operated. But from the get-go, Apona's goals were really oriented to meeting Manouche people where they were and addressing the needs that they actually had, in terms of a wide array of things, from economic development to healthcare and education, and music being like a really key facet of that. A lot of the Manouche participants in this organization were very much on board with this, using music to promote awareness and get attention for these other needs. Some of them were not always on board with that, and so that kind of played out a bit differentially. But all in all, from what I was able to glean archivally and from talking to people who were involved with it, is that largely because of their concerted efforts to address all of these needs in all of these different areas, and to really recognize the diversity of needs, most people were pretty much on board with what they did. And so these festivals were overall a very good thing for the different communities. So I also then moved to talking about the festival Django Reinhardt, which is the longest Jazz Manouche or Jazz Manouche centric festival in existence that happens near Paris almost every year. And their approach from the beginning was very kind of Manouche or it was focused on the family of Django Reinhardt, and in promoting this at that point in the 70s, it was still a nascent genre, but promoting Jazz Manouche. And over time, their focus on Jazz Manouche has lessened. It's become more of kind of a global jazz kind of festival. And they're also their interest in supporting either Django Reinhardt's family directly or other extended members of, a Manouche, a very kind of broadly conceived Manouche community, has also faltered. And this has a lot to do with the financial interests of the festival and making a name also for the village where it's located. So as I describe in the book, there's a lot of tensions between the inhabitants of the village and gens du voyage, or traveling Romany people who are not permanent members of the village. So and then I of course, at the festival I think you were kind of referring to, after that was the festival Jazz Manouche de Zillesheim, where I really saw that play out firsthand over the course of a span of 5 years, how the festival went from being very, very celebratory and supportive of the local Manouche community, and then that kind of mission started becoming lost in the name again of promoting the festival itself. And that was one of the situations where I really was able to get a very fine-grained understanding of all of the kinds of conflicts and ambivalences that people had with the festival, both on the side of Manouche community members, but then also Manouche performers and non-Manouche performers, and the organizers who were largely non-Manouche. And so I really, my analysis of that, there's a lot that I leave out in the book about like what kind of built up to my conclusion that, this festival once was really good for the Manouche community, and now it's just kind of lost that purpose. And just too many interactions to really account for or ethically reproduce in the text of the book. But it just became clear to me also that it's not just a one-sided thing of the organizers losing interest in the Manouche community, because I really don't think that they believe that they have. I think it's also a question of the performers, some of whom come from the community, but most of whom don't. And when I say community, I mean like the community literally next to the festival site. But even members of that community as well have had very kind of changing and also conflicting with each other kinds of feelings about what the festival does or is supposed to do. So this is a very long way of getting to your question of like how these kinds of individual conflicts also connect up to the institutional level, and the institution could be as small as this, once a year festival in a village, or as large as something like APANA that interfaces with the European Union and the Council of Europe and all of that. But you see patterns of very similar kinds of conflicts going on that just really hinge on where the leaders of the institutions are putting their energies.
Thank you so much. Ingrid, was there a question you also wanted to direct?
I think we should go to audience questions.
Great. Yeah, if anyone would like to pass a question on to Siv, I'm happy to field it through the chat. I think that might be easier than all of us unmuting ourselves.
Okay. Well, if people are going to write a couple questions down, the other kind of parallel question I had, Siv, just curiously, so you've talked about the Manouche and the ethno-racialization of them in France. Do they have it? Does the community have relationships with, for example, the African immigrants to France, the Senegalese, Malians, et cetera, and so the African sense of ethno-racialization in France, do they share similar dilemmas? Are they different? Are the Manouche interested in it or not?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So I think this actually, so my response gets to what Carol was bringing up. I believe it was in the last question or the one before, about how, the very idea of speaking about a Manouche community is very fraught, because there is no coherent community. And even when you're talking about in any particular location, like in a given city, I worked mainly in Strasbourg, there is no singular Manouche community there. It's all very dispersed. And the people I tended to work with actually were mostly, because a lot of them were musicians who spent a lot of time, doing self-promotion and kind of like working outside of what might be considered a Manouche community. They saw themselves as kind of like in between communities and not really fully part of one particular Manouche community. They kind of had feet in each world. And so that said, in terms of like interfacing with other, be it African or even other kinds of ethno-racially minoritized communities, that had a lot to do, the extent to which that happened had a lot to do with the location of these Manouche individuals and communities. So for example, in Strasbourg, one of the kinds of areas I worked in is a neighborhood that's to the south of the city that is socioeconomically just not super well off, and also happens to be a very ethno-racially diverse neighborhood with immigrant communities from a lot of different places. And so because of them being like in the same neighborhood and facing a lot of very similar socioeconomic circumstances, there was a kind of a fair amount of interaction, especially among young people who were in school together and their parents, and also the arts activities that they were involved with. So I worked a lot at the music school in that neighborhood that I talk about in chapter 2. And so that's really a site where people do have these interactions. There's also some professional musicians who very intentionally are working across ethno-racial boundaries to work with not just people of different ethno-racial backgrounds, but also different kinds of musical traditions, and really are invested in crossing those boundaries and creating something new. But beyond that, it really is a very case-by-case basis, especially when it comes to how they envision their own ethno-racialization in comparison to that of others. And to be honest, a lot of my thinking on this happened after I got back from the field and was really kind of like more self-consciously looking at other cases where people have been racialized or racialized themselves in France. And it wasn't like a huge topic of conversation to compare those experiences to other immigrant populations in France. Like it happened, but it wasn't like, at the forefront of everyone's mind, because a lot of what I heard was really talking about, people were really talking about a Manouche world and a Gajo world. And in these contexts, Gajo typically means white. But then, these other conversations about their relationships with other groups came up here and there, but it wasn't like the main frame through which they were thinking about things. But that is something that I definitely want to explore more as I, continue, working in France and, trying to figure out how all of these dynamics play out. But that's a really good question. And I wish I could tell you more details on it, but it just didn't come up quite as much as I would have hoped.
Not to worry.
Thank you. Yeah, so we have a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, can you talk about how we make sense of non-Manouche musicians who've embraced this tradition both in France, but also beyond? I'm thinking about how Gypsy jazz has a strong following and base here in the US. How do we make sense of the ethno-racial politics of those performers and the appropriation of the musical tradition?
Great question. Thank you, Ariel. Yeah, this is something I've actually not really mentioned in this session so far, but it is really important. At this point in time, I would say there are probably more non-Manouche people who perform in the genre of Jazz Manouche and also who consume it than there are Manouche people. Many people I know in Manouche communities in France kind of lament that it is a dying practice among them. And this is some people relate it to the fact that it has gained such popularity among non-Manouche people, but I don't really think that's necessarily the case. But in any case, non-Manouche people are not just contemporary producers and consumers of this genre, but they were also have long been, since its inception, really key parts of the scene itself. It's never been an exclusively Manouche scene. It's just been kind of portrayed that way for various reasons. I would not even call the non-Manouche participation in this genre appropriation per se, just for the fact of playing it. It does tread into appropriation when non-Manouche performers kind of try to take on a certain kind of stereotyped Manouche persona, which some do. And then that's when things start to become kind of problematic. So it's I can totally see how in the way that I've presented things today that, it is appears to be a very ethno-racially unique practice. But the reality is that just a lot of people from outside the community perform it, and a lot of Manouche people are very, they embrace that and they welcome it, as long as their participation is done in a respectful way that, does not draw on stereotypes or, make things harder for them. Now, there are other related issues that come up sometimes, especially among Manouche musicians who sometimes might feel like their livelihoods are being stolen from them if a non-Manouche performer is stealing their business, basically. Then things can start getting a little bit tense. And there are other reasons where things could get tense as well. But in general, I find that it tends to be not as problematic as one might assume.
Thank you. And we have a couple of related questions that are coming in. The first is from Dave Wilson, which is, many jazz communities are shaped by white frames of jazz instruction and higher education. And in many cases, white musicians gravitate towards gypsy jazz in part as a strategy of distancing from Black music, signaling a discomfort with Blackness. I'm wondering if there are elements of the book, not having read it other than related articles, that could serve as interventions in courses for students of jazz, especially as interconnecting race, ethno-race, and political economy.
Thank you, Dave, for that question. Yeah, so I mean, I've written this book hopefully to include a much wider audience than just scholars who are interested in Romani musics and jazz studies, but also I know of a few Jazz Manouche musicians who have also picked up the book and started reading it. So that's also what I've really been hoping for. And I think this is a really fascinating observation that some musicians gravitate towards gypsy jazz to distance themselves kind of from Black music. And it is true that especially in the US, the Jazz Manouche or gypsy jazz scene, as it's called here, tends to be overwhelmingly white. And a lot of people come to the scene not so much from jazz per se, as performers in jazz, but from other string-based American genres such as bluegrass, for example. So it's kind of a very interesting demographic in the US and then also in other places throughout the world. I should mention that Jazz Manouche is performed in many major cities throughout the world. So there are different kinds of scenes on virtually all inhabited continents. But so I do hope that this book can make an intervention in jazz education to not just expose students to a different strand of jazz history that goes beyond its kind of US-centric dominant narrative, but that it can also get students to start thinking about the racial politics of jazz beyond a Black and white binary, but also in terms of all of these other kinds of questions about ethno-race that need to come up.
Yeah, thank you very much. And relatedly, we have a question following up on Ariel Bierbaum's invocation of the term appropriation. It's also interesting to consider whether the Manouche adoption of jazz as, in scare quotes, their own musical tradition constitutes an appropriation of a Black American musical culture. You write that many of them insist that they are not playing jazz. I'm not sure that appropriation is necessarily the most helpful way of understanding these complexities, but it's interesting to think about. So I guess this is an invitation to think about the portability of the term appropriation in the context of Manouche music.
Yeah, and thank you, Ben, for that question. Ben Given, also, for those of you who do not know, is one of the foremost scholars on Django Reinhardt and has also been a huge influence on this work. So I mean, you bring up the point that a lot of these musicians really insist that their music not be considered jazz manouche, but jazz on its own, because they see themselves as part of this tradition originating in the US, and they really want to see themselves as part of this kind of whether US centric or global kind of cosmopolitan jazz scene. And so in that sense, if they are characterizing jazz as this kind of practice that is rooted in a particular ethno-racial community, but available to all, then the question of appropriation becomes less important or less salient for them, because they see it as this kind of global language in a certain way. But at the same time, many of these musicians are also leading on the ethnoracial specificity of jazz and doing that kind of analogizing that I talked about before. So my sense is that because some of these musicians justify their performance of jazz as not being appropriative because they share a certain kind of affinity with Black Americans, then that does not become like an ethical question for them. Really, it's just kind of something that is their right to perform. But then if you think about it in another way, it could certainly be thought of as a kind of appropriation. But I think the kinds of relative power dynamics that are going on and the ways in which Manouche see themselves as fundamentally oppressed within Europe, they sometimes see that as giving them like a certain license to play this music, even if it doesn't technically, didn't come from them originally. So there's all of these different kinds of dynamics at play, and there's no easy answer to that, because I think a lot of musicians are also kind of working with these different ideas simultaneously.
Yeah, thank you so much. We have one question in the chat, and maybe after this one, we'll have time for one or two more. But this participant asks, as you point out, Alsatian Jazz Manouche has evolved under the influence of specific socio-political and commercial groups. There is an opportunity here for studying a natural experiment by comparing this community and its views of itself and its music to those of Paris and Holland. Have you given any thought to this? And if so, what differences have you noticed?
So thank you, Peter. Peter has also been very deeply involved with the Alsatian Jazz Manouche scene for a number of years. So yes, this question from a perspective of that experience. And so, yeah, I think that is a really great question, and something that I've thought a lot about comparing the Alsatian case to the Parisian and the Dutch and possibly other cases as well. But due to limitations of time and also language skills in the Dutch case, I haven't really been able to do that kind of comparative work. I have done a little bit in terms of the comparing the Alsatian scene to the Parisian scene. And if we are to talk about kind of the idea of Manouche community, at least historically, it's seemed a bit more kind of cohesive to me in Alsace than it has in Paris. And in Paris, that the scene is a little bit more diffused than it has been historically in Alsace. So it's been easier to study in Alsace for that reason. But in Paris, Paris is really the kind of commercial hub for jazz manouche production, and has been for a while. But yeah, I think doing a more kind of concerted methodical comparison between the two would be really interesting, especially because the whole political economic context of race in all of these places, in the Netherlands, but also in Belgium and in Germany as well, would offer a lot of really good insight. And people have done, there's been studies of what's called Sinti jazz in Germany as well, that have also, I think, make for a great case for comparison. But yeah, thank you for that. That's something I definitely would love to pursue.
Well, we will look forward to your next book and collaborations with other scholars as well. Thank you all so much for being here today and for asking these thought-provoking questions. Thank you to our respondents, Carol Silverman and Ingrid Monson. And we encourage you all to visit Siv's website for lots more exciting music and historical documents and photographs, and also to read her book. So thank you, and it's been a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you all so much. I really, really deeply appreciate everyone who showed up. And then also thank you so much to Molly and Carol and Ingrid for being here and making this such a wonderful session. This has been great for me.
Thanks for inviting us. It was great.